Greetings, Zer0 Books readers. Today, we are joined by Leonard and Connor Gallagher, authors of the 2014 book, Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War Against America's Maoists, for its re-release on October 28th this year. This book is perhaps the most exhaustive account to date of the history of the American Revolutionary Union, or RU, which in 1975 reconstituted itself as the Revolutionary Communist Party USA, or the RCP USA, which still exists today. This group's associations spanned as far as the Black Panthers, the official Chinese Communist Party, and, despite its own best efforts, the FBI. It is this final association with which Aaron and Connor's book is primarily concerned. And the story of the RU-RCP is a story of the FBI and the lengths to which its operatives went to prevent the creation of a united anti-capitalist front within the United States. Heavy Radicals should be regarded as essential reading for anyone interested in anti-capitalist resistance in the US from the 1950s to 70s. Josh Moufawad-Paul, a highly regarded expert in Maoist philosophy and three-time Zer0 Books author, has also kindly agreed to join me to discuss the book with its authors. Aaron and Connor, thank you very much for agreeing to speak with us today.
Happy to be here.
Well, just to start us off with, I'd like to ask you if you could both tell us a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, what it was that brought you to this topic, and the significance of the re-edition of the book.
Connor, why don't you kick it off?
Well, I had first come across the RCP as it was then in about high school. I was getting involved in anti-police brutality work and other things going on in about the mid-90s. And partially what drew me to the group at that time was this idea of them not just promoting communism, but actually connecting it to states that held power at various points. And even though in their estimation, both those places, Soviet Union and China, were no longer communist or socialist states, it was still this idea of, it wasn't just sort of an abstract philosophy or idea, it was this idea of actually trying to wield power in a way that changed the world in a way that actually wasn't on a small scale or a personal level, but actually trying to radically change the world. And being that I was interested in history, as I started looking into it, and this would, I guess, foreshadow the book I work on much later, was how much that the importance of Maoism was woven within essentially the history of the 60s and what came afterwards, and how much that was sort of missing from the current understanding of that period. To the degree that it was mentioned, it was usually a footnote or as almost a precautionary tale of, this is where the 60s went bad anytime anyone looked towards anything revolutionary or radical in this sort of realm dealing with Lenin, Mao, and things of this ilk.
Yeah, I was around I was never on the scene when the RU existed. I kind of probably have a decade younger than most of the originators of this, a decade to 15 years. So, I came of age in the early to mid 70s, and I met the group when I was living in the Northwest. I joined their unemployed organization, and then they asked me to go do youth work. So, and then I ended up being with them for a very long time. Like many things in life, you make some connections, you make some commitments, and short of a calamity, you maintain them. It's akin to marriage. You try to work through problems and hang on. But finally, some 15 years ago now, I finally broke with the group. I stayed at the party way too long, in hindsight, staying at the party literally and metaphorically. But when I left, I was, I wanted to try to make sense of my life, maybe try to justify, all those years, which sounded like a neat and tidy project. Of course, once you dig into it, you find, there's this line from Mary Chapin Carpenter: "There's no such thing as no regrets." I vested a lot in that, and I started working on this history, and then Connor and I started talking and said, let's look a little bit at what the intelligence agencies were doing, and we just tentatively pulled on that string, and then Connor just kind of went, what's the adjective? He went full bore on this, and started discovering there's archives all over the place with various things, and then he started requesting freedom of information things. He was telling me how he did that, and then I did it. What we discovered was there is this abundant history of the RURCP, which the Bureau in 1976 said, the RCP and its front organizations constitute a threat to the internal security of the United States of the first magnitude. I mean, part of this was hyperbole to justify a rather massive investigation, but also part of it was the fact that this group was a pro-Maoist party in the United States. At a point where there were, the diminishing three poles of the Soviet Union, Chinese communism, and the United States. These were real threats, contrasted to more amorphous or groups engaged in political violence. These were coherent organizations operating nationwide with a whole program and policy with the potential to become, more of a deal than their small numbers belied. So we started looking at that, and we discovered there's this huge untold story. There's the untold story of, the anti-communist U.S. I mean, I took a Cold War education where I remember my 10th grade social studies teacher teaching us dialectical materialism in order to debunk it. That a whole cohort of young, radically inclined people, started investigating Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, even though small in numbers, very significant. So, so going from wanting to be in a group that had all the answers to staying too long to leaving and then discovering, well, there's this whole other story that we wanted to give to, those so inclined to see a different future so they don't have to just replicate, all the missteps and misunderstand or underestimate the forces that would try to stop them. And worse.
If I can just jump in there then, may I ask what it was that led you to break with the RCP when you did?
I'm not really going to tell that story because it's a whole convolution, but I did have a reflection into, and I'd be curious what Connor thinks of this, but, certain groups, they just kind of keep going, right? Like the Communist Party in the United States, by 1949, they had upwards of 80 to 100,000 members, which is in proportion to the US population, okay, that's not massive. But in terms of a communist organization in the United States, it's huge. Well, by the mid-60s, Gus Hall had this operation with, several thousand, maybe more members of the Communist Party. It's kind of my conception, the RCP still exists, but it's kind of, a comparison of the CP of 49 to the CP of 65, 66. And you could say this about other organizations. They still have a coherence, they have a leadership, and they've been able to hold on to some old timers and attract new people. But as far as their overall kind of impact, it's much less. And I say that by way of saying there was a certain realization that kind of came to me that it's time to go. This group, it's not all that anymore. And you got to kind of stop holding on to that. So that's the kind of maybe the short, even euphemistic version, but that's as honest as I can be right now.
Sure. Josh, do you want to jump in now?
I wasn't sure if that was like the
yeah, of course.
Starting in, or if even Connor was doing that. So it's like, oh, is it my turn? I mean, I want to say before I ask my question, this is great to be part of this. Like I do remember reading your book when it first came out, right? The first edition, right? Writing a review of it back then. I was like, what, 2015? I think maybe it was also like, it was a time I mean, you came and did, because I'm in Toronto, and I know you did a book launch, and I don't know if you both were there, but because I didn't make it, but I know Aaron, you were there. A book launch at Another Story, which I couldn't make because of like childcare responsibilities. We had a young kid; she'd just been born a bit earlier than that, and so I was home taking care of the kid. But I got my friend got a book and got you to sign it for me too. There, so it's but I was I'm sad about missing that. So I'm really glad that I could make this and actually be able to ask questions that questions I wouldn't have been able to ask then because I hadn't read the book yet. But now I've read it, and I'm excited about the second edition with the stuff you added. So just to get into my question there, I kind of want to begin. This question is that your book is ostensibly about the FBI infiltration of the RU or the RCP USA, and as you pointed out earlier, that infiltration was carried out because it might have been hyperbole, but also just because of the size of it, they were seen as a serious threat. But one thing I found fascinating about the story you guys tell in this book is that irrespective of that infiltration, the organization's decline was also driven by its own internal life. And I'm thinking of the internal struggles that led to Bruce Franklin's exit in 1970, that took a faction of the RU to Zer0, or later the split around the question of the capitalist roaders and the Gang of Four that also saw the exit of Liebel Bergman, both of which you covered in the book in great detail. And one thing I noticed in your documentation, which accords with my own understanding as an outsider in Canada who's knows a bit about this group from the outside, is that the RCP was, and I guess probably still is in that kind of zombie organization form you've talked about, but it was an organization incapable of meaningful self-criticism. And what I mean here is it never seemed to really be able to assess how these splits came into existence beyond cosmetic pronouncements, just as it has never been able to ever account for any errors it has made in its past. So, for example, it hasn't really fully criticized for its position on the Boston busing crisis, and that's again you talk about in the book where they opposed racial integration for some workerist reason, nor its egregious homophobia, back like that when it used to have that line that being gay was bourgeois decadence. It never really kind of criticized that those mistakes in a thoughtful manner, just kind of switched its position without doing it. And it doesn't really suggest it learned anything. So what I'm really trying to the question I'm trying to ask with all this preamble is about whether you can talk briefly about the interplay between state infiltration and these internal conditions. Would state infiltration have been as damaging if it had not been? Would those internal conditions have been as damaging if it had not been for state interference? And did the internal life of the party at certain points of time provide larger opportunity for infiltrators, and how?
Connor, do you want to try that? I have some things to say on that. So.
Yeah, a few points. I think you're correct that the FBI infiltration was a disruptive factor, but it was not the determining factor in those problems. And as you point out, the RCP did not have a great track record of self-reflection, and I would say honest criticism, because there has been criticism, but I don't know if I'll use honest, which I'll get into more in a second. Essentially, what we discovered in going through this is I think there's a bit of a caricature some of the left has that an FBI informant goes into a meeting and says, hey, let's go bomb the Capitol, and then they go and arrest people. And what actually we found out through going through these documents, not just of the RU, but of other groups during this time period, is they think the FBI feels that having an informant is way more valuable than the possibility of prosecution, because once you prosecute, you have to have the witness and you give up the informant. So there's been numerous cases besides the RU, also like Chicago Black Panthers, where the charges were dropped because they didn't want to name their informant. So Hoover's approach in the FBI generally was having an informant who's giving the information is much more important than getting a small arrest here or there. And so what they did is they didn't invent these problems. Like, as I said, they didn't just go into a meeting and invent a problem. What they did, and this is where I think also they've been underestimated by certain forces in the left, is they looked at contradictions that were existing in the group and they figured out how to work them and press them as much as possible. So as you mentioned, one of the things that's, besides the fact that no history had been done of the RU-RCP, is it actually, the history of the group actually concentrates the major questions of the 60s, if you look at where the fault lines and splits are. So you were mentioning the first major split in the Revolutionary Union, where Bruce Franklin takes a group of members of the RU and splits off. And that essentially was a disagreement over, was now the time to start revolution, which has a lot in common with the groups that would go down that path, like the Black Liberation Army, the Weather People, which essentially is sort of the most militant version possible of the allyship interpretation of a united front, right? This idea of, it was the job of white revolutionaries to help oppress nationalities by starting armed revolution right now. And that didn't work out very well for Zer0 Books, which is why they're not as well known as the Weather People. But essentially that contradiction was there. Also other contradictions the FBI pushed on when a leader of the Revolutionary Union, Don Wright, was involved in another major split with the party toward the RU. He essentially was this FBI informant. He was Black, and he was really pushing this thing of Black leaders to the front and sort of pushing on a contradiction. And so, and clearly there was some room for those views because Avakian, who would become the leader of the party, was initially the one working with other groups like the Black Workers Congress, the Young Lords Party, which by that time had become the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. And they then replaced their representative to that sort of coalition that they were trying to form, to this idea of uniting to form one party. They replaced the Avakian, who was white, with Wright, who was Black, not realizing he was an FBI informant at the time. So he was able to get some of a hearing while he was doing this, Justice Franklin. So the FBI wasn't inventing these problems. They were just noticing them and then pushing them as much as they could. I mean, this all sort of also goes back to this group that Wright came out of, which is the Ad Hoc Committee, which is this fictitious group the FBI created. And they didn't create it to be Maoist, but they couldn't believe their luck. So initially they created it to disrupt the Communist Party by essentially putting out a Maoist line. But then once Maoism actually became the most radical voice in America, then they realized they already had this pre-existing Maoist group, and they just were able to then turn it and use it on the RU. So in terms of the FBI, once again, I would say they were smart at identifying what the contradictions were, where there were different lines or understanding within the group, and then figuring out how to push them and then split the group as far as possible. I mean, they did also target certain people for COINTEL operations, like Bergman, like Chris Milton, who was a member of the RU, who had been actually a Red Guard when he lived in China earlier, as well as Label Bergman himself. In terms of the history of I don't think this is unique to the RU, but there has been a thing of not wanting to embarrass themselves, I think is how they see it, in terms of admitting the mistakes they've made. So this includes the fact that they've never, since the book came out, and we've only had more evidence since the first book came out, which we put out in our second book, A Threat of the First Magnitude, which really shows the case is closed on this guy, Donald Wright, being FBI informant. But the RCP has never acknowledged this, which you would think would be important because he was one of the leaders of the leading group of the party at a key point where it was actually trying to unite other groups. And through his efforts, where he was essentially saying one thing to the RCP and then saying other stuff to the groups like Black Workers Congress, Puerto Rican Workers Organization, it split that possibility of unite. They may not have come together, we don't know, but it definitely made it possible that they couldn't, because he's telling one thing to one group and one thing to another and creating all this division within that. And and you brought up the busing incident, which for people familiar with it, I mean, one of the things we document in the book was at that time that came out, the RU had taken this position off of the negative aspect of trying to unite these other groups into one party to make a multinational communist party. They had decided that the main contradiction in the US, the main problem with the communist movement, was essentially revolutionary nationalism. And that was the main danger within the communist movement. And that is not something that the RCP ever mentions in relation to how did they get to this crazy bus position where they essentially opposed integration, if you want to put it in the most bold statement possible, right? But it follows that if they had this bad experience with this National Liaison Committee, and then they decide that bourgeois nationalism is the main danger within the communist movement, well, of course they're going to get to it. It doesn't surprise you that they get to this busing position, but they don't want to actually do that critical work. I mean, also this is more complicated, the hoops they have to jump through, because they sort of have to occasionally say, like, act like they do some element of self-criticism, but there's also this thing that Avakian's essentially infallible in terms of how they interpret their own history. So they sort of get some weird places.
Yeah. So, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, Bob Avakian is, he emerged as the main leader of the group. But just to kind of add, look, I went into this, hoping to, like I said at the beginning, is to kind of justify, having kind of joined up with the best group out there. The more I went through it, the less I liked what I saw. But, it's a very complex thing, what you're asking. Look, I've made this point many times. At the end of the day, the RURCP owns what it did. You can't say the FBI made all this stuff happen. At the same time, they were there. So to act as if that didn't have a profound impact is not accurate, and it's not especially helpful. But at the end of the book, I talk about, look, the fundamental problem was they accepted a lot of this canon of what Marxism-Leninism was from a legacy standpoint. The person who initiated this group, Label Bergman, he was an old Communist Party member, and he sought to recreate the old CP, sending people into industry at a time in the 70s when manufacturing was profoundly shifting in the United States. An unemployed workers organizing committee for a recession in the 70s, which was profoundly different than the one in the 30s. A defense of Stalin that was somewhat critical, but only skated the surface. I mean, there's myriad problems. The reason the RURCP kind of was successful was because of its tethering to China. We have a really good interview with Danielle Zora, who went to China in 71, 6 months before Nixon, along with the RU delegation. And she has some profound insights about what it was like in China at that point. Kind of the amazing thing the Chinese people were doing, the masses, collectively. But at the same time, there is a bureaucracy that has no interest in this. China itself is getting pulled two different ways. The RURCP is tethering itself to a country that is getting pulled two different ways. I mean, one of the problems we have in the world today is we have no models. We are living in the ashes of the socialist project of the 20th century. It is not the currency that there's this communist world to be attained. Yes, there are many people who still see this, some actively fighting for it, organized organizations from India, Nepal, and places all over the world. But it's a qualitatively different situation than what it was. In the 70s, we thought there was an answer, a goal to be achieved. Well, it turned out, that Mao died and everything got reversed. Even when Mao was alive, he was navigating the fact that a huge section of his party didn't want to have anything to do with him. So it's a tangle and a thicket. I'd like to have written a book that says, here's how to fix everything screwed up this group did, at various points. Just on the Boston busing thing. There's a working the refs thing. Don Wright, who is this African-American comrade who basically gets up to the secretariat of this group, the four people who lead the day-to-day thing. And he's basically pushing a view, we don't need a multinational party, we need to be a party of many nationalities. And he sabotages this nascent coalition. And then, the response by the RU is to just shift all the way to the right. So it's like, well, how do you fix that? Because, the matter of Black people and liberation in the United States is like an extremely complex and important issue. And if you screw up, you screw up big time. That's exactly what happened. The FBI has a hand in it, but, the RU made its own decisions and such. But mainly it's like this, it's, how do I wish I could sit here and tell you, well, here's how we got to do it. Here's how we're going to get to this communist type world. And here's the type of organization. I will say this, I was having a talk with some old comrades recently, and we were talking about democratic centralism. And, the problem with the RURCP is it was centralism. And I think with a lot of these groups, it's like the whole democratic centralism. This is concept of Marxist-Leninist Party, which is that there's mass discussion and everybody has input, and it gets fed up to the leadership who synthesize that and they come up with the best policy. In reality, more times than not, leadership comes up with the best policy. Sometimes they do okay, sometimes not so much. So there's a whole critique of democratic centralism to be made. When Bruce Franklin left the group in '71 because he wanted to kind of initiate hostilities on a certain level, the RU basically doubled down on having a more democratic centralist group. It was kind of the death of the 60s, for the group. The 60s was all about question everything, question authority. And there was an element of that within the RU. These are all students and youth, and people are smoking pot, and they're listening to the music and stuff. And, and then suddenly they're talking about democratic centralism and, subsuming what they believe to the higher authority. And, there's a time and place for military discipline, but for an organization to exist and operate in a vibrant way, I would say it becomes very fraught. So yeah, both Connor and I have talked at length on that question, but I think we could talk probably several days because you kind of hit a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, something that struck me while reading your book was the way in which the FBI approached its task of dismantling the RU. Based on events like the 1971 trip to China, the FBI seems to have formally, at least, opposed the RU on the basis that they were led by agents representing the interests of foreign powers, namely the Chinese state. However, as you show in your book, this wasn't an obviously true assessment of the RU. This almost makes it seem like the FBI, and by extension the American government, was incapable of accepting the reality of a homegrown all-American communist movement. Why do you think this was the case, and how did this portrayal of the RU as foreign agents help the FBI to justify its actions?
Well, I think there's actually some truth to it. Label Bergman did have ties to China. He had lived in China. There's repeated references in his file of he came back to the United States in '68 to do a favor for a friend. I think there was, high likelihood there was a conversation in China that we need, somebody who's sympathetic to our position. There was this other group called the Progressive Labor Party, which had kind of had the China franchise. But for reasons that I think are really worth excavating that we don't know, the Progressive Labor Party transformed pretty dramatically in the '68-'69 period. They went from kind of being, they started adopting positions that, all nationalism is reactionary, and thus the Black Panther Party, which were an extremely appealing organization, both among radical Black masses, but also youth. They adopted the position that that group is beyond the pale. We don't support that. They adopted the view that we don't support, the North Vietnamese, in the struggle in Vietnam because it's fundamentally a nationalist struggle. So they lost, and then they started making criticisms of Mao. So, circa '68, '69, I think the Chinese were looking for a new, this geopolitics, don't underestimate it. China is a big deal for the United States. The Soviet Union is a big deal for the United States. I was telling Connor, a friend recently shared a file where, the Communist Party is being investigated right up until 1991, and the file reads like the stuff we have on the RCP circa 1976. It's an active investigation. Geopolitics and having, what the U.S. would brand an agent of a foreign power is a very big deal. So I think that brought a lot of attention to the U.S. But then there's a funny little wrinkle, right? Because in 71, the U.S. is trying to do rapprochement with China. They're trying to get out of Vietnam, and they don't want to be confronting China and the Soviet Union. And they basically reconcile diplomatically. Hoover wants to circulate this statement about the RU and the growing danger, and basically it gets pulled because it's going to make Nixon look bad, is our sense. So kind of, I think that's, and yes, it's overstated because people in this group didn't consider themselves just blind followers of Chinese communism. The people who made up this group, I was just at this conference of the anti-war resistance up in Seattle, and I was actually quite astonished to see how many veterans actually gravitated toward the RURCP. Not tens of thousands, but significant numbers of vets who had gone to Vietnam came back and were disgusted and wanted to basically battle this imperialism that they had been press ganged, in a sense, to fight for. There was appeal on a very specific level. People don't take these kind of leaps generally just on abstraction. There's usually something material that impels them to do it. And, people who got, read Hunter Thompson about getting the shit beat out of him in Chicago in 68. It turned his head around. There are certain things that turn their head around. And radicals in the U.S. who had their heads turned around gravitated to the RU.
I think there's also an aspect going back to the Russian Revolution that the FBI's formulation of communism has always seen it as an alien and foreign thing, and that part of that is just the timing of when it happened. Right, the U.S. coming out of World War I and becoming more isolationist at the same time that you're beginning to finally have limits on immigration, and that whole sort of prejudicial eugenics movement connected with it, and the idea that it was, and Hoover very much saw communism as this foreign alien thing. And you can see, we think of often things like in the 20s, like the Palmer raids, and how people who were involved in communist organizations who are immigrants were deported. We find this in the files still through the 60s and 70s. Anytime there's anyone who wasn't born in the U.S. who's in the RU, the FBI always wants to look into their background and see about the possibility of deporting them, and that's just an abstraction. One of the main members of the RU in Philadelphia was a Canadian grad student at Temple, and he actually ended up being deported over this. So there is this. So I think part of it is there are actual connections. Like one FBI informant, Morris Childs, was actually delivering money from the Soviet Union to the CP, and since he was important to the FBI, they knew that and they had all the records. And they never found a connection like that quite with China, but they did always heard rumors and whispers that Bergman had back channels to China, maybe had connections with the embassies up in I think it's Ottawa. So so part of it is just this thing going back decades of the idea of always seeing this as a foreign, un-American thing. And so partially it was just a disbelief that there could actually be anything autonomous or American born about this. But then part of it is also tugging on some things that there are some connections, and then thinking that that is the point of it. And this is partially why Hoover was so concerned with groups like the RU and before them the CP, was he really felt worried about these connections to the socialist states in other parts of the world. So besides the fact that sort of part of our book is making the point that the RU, the Maoist movement, is really missing from 60s history. It really sort of misunderstands what was Hoover's main concern, even at that point, is that it was still this idea of there's some communist sphere out there that is the main threat to the US.
Okay, I guess it's time for my question again. And this is, I guess, well, a question that deals, you guys mentioned it earlier about the just side mentions of Bob Avakian, right? So, I mean, any discussion on the RU, RCP USA at some point is going to have to deal with the question of Bob Avakian. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like what I want to say about this before we get to that question is that like you've kind of charted out a history of the RU, RCP USA and heavy radicals that makes anyone who reads it kind of struck by how significant they were, right? And you talk about like kind of the mass organizations they commanded. I mean, earlier, Aaron, you even mentioned even, you know, you were struck still like veterans being drawn to it, right? And in the past, you talked about the Vietnam Veteran Association and other mass organizations they had, and how at a certain point they could intervene significantly in certain social struggles. But, you know, those of us today, especially those of us in other countries that are like familiar with this or have met, you know, former members like yourselves or members that are still embedded in it, the kind of thing that we first would see about the RU, RCP USA was not that history, right? But we'd have this familiarity with this kind of, I guess, seeing the RCP USA as this cult of Bob Avakian, right? And so it's somewhat surprising for those of us on the like outside of the US, or maybe some readers in the US who just run into the RCP USA as being people talking about how Bob is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But, you know, because today's version of the RCP is kind of absurdly dedicated to this mythology of its chairman as the greatest thinker of all time. And you know, there's articles that kind of get lampooned that they put out, right, that almost read like satire articles, where they have one article comparing like Bob Avakian to Jimi Hendrix, or like an article where they went to Burning Man and put Bob's face all down the highway to Burning Man. And it was like, it's just absurd, right? And so, and that elevation of Avakian also, and him as the great thinker, right, it has wreaked havoc internationally, because, you know, there was the revolutionary internationalist movement that was like a meeting of multiple, you know, Maoist organizations around the world. And one of the main reasons it fell apart, according to people I've spoken from the other organizations, like from Afghanistan or from India and things like that, is because the RCP USA was really trying to push this new synthesis, right? That, you know, Avakian's line being the next new synthesis, like better than Mao even, right? And so they really have this elevation of him into this, you know, this great figure. So I guess, you know, all that is to say is like, do you have any, so like, how did this cult of Avakian develop? Like, was it always there at its inception? I mean, I do know from having read like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Outlaw Woman, that she talks about meeting Avakian in, I can't remember if from the book, if it's the late 60s or early 70s. And like, she was interested in the RU or the RCP USA, but she got weirded out by Avakian and didn't want to like join. So like how did it develop? And also, was it helped along by FBI infiltration?
Yeah, it's look, it's the big question on the table. To the degree people know who the Revolutionary Communist Party is today, they know the cult of Bob Avakian. I was speaking with an old comrade a couple of years ago, and he kind of made this point. He just wished the RCP would go away, you know, because at this point it's more embarrassment to even say you had been associated with. Look, I don't wish them any harm. I mean, they are, you know, they're kind of a big juicy target for MAGA type people, and I think people need to be mindful of that. It's easy to spend a lot of energy going after this low-hanging fruit, the cult of Avakian. Avakian does not have the answers. You know, the new synthesis, you know, it's just not everything they make it out to be. I wish it was, you know. I wish, if not him, somebody else, I wish there was this grand synthesis. It evolved to get to this kind of almost place of parody. You know, having been in the midst of it, I remember a documentary on Jonestown. One of the survivors, this was some years ago, kind of made a point. Well, you know, they call us cultists, and that way they don't have to understand it. which I thought was kind of a profound thing because, look, following Jim Jones is bad. It will, lead to a bad end, but it was based on some complexity and stuff. So just dismissing Avakian because it's cultish is a little easy. Okay, saying that, our book ends in 1980 because that is a certain tipping point. I mean, I'm going to leave aside your whole point of the revolutionary internationalist movement, which is important, but beyond, I think, what we can say here. In 1980, there was a turn. Mao died in 1976. In late 77, 78, there's a schism in this group between people who kind of want to hold on to what's going on in China. The new leader, Hua Guofeng, is Mao's appointed successor, and that's going to lead to Deng Xiaoping, and there's enough socialism there that we can hold on to that. And then Avakian, who said, no, this is all wrong. Everything in China is wrong, and everything about our group has been kind of wrong up to now. We need to reconstitute it. They have an action when Deng Xiaoping comes to the U.S., which, it's the RCP kind of doing, an excitative incident that gets a lot of people arrested. 77 people are charged with felonies. They're facing 5 years in prison. The government calibrates it down and, hits Avakian with a lot of charges. And at this point, Avakian grew up with the Panthers and the campaign to free Huey Newton, and essentially kind of emulates that and starts putting himself forward as the RCP's version of Huey Newton. But it's a different world. 1979 is not 1969. Contradictions are moving on. But I did want to kind of go back because, time is tight. There's a lot in our book people can hold on to. So some really, I was going to say meaty stuff, but I'm thinking of the vegans out there. There's substantial stuff in there. And it really is counterintuitive to what's out there in the pop culture. People keep sending me this link. Have you listened to this new podcast by Zaid Ayers? I'm sorry, I'm missing up the name. It's a new podcast on the weathermen, right? It's like 2022, and we're still talking about the big impact of the weathermen, when in fact the weathermen was a qualitatively different radical organization. First off, it was quite small. And the other thing is they were the target of a criminal investigation by the powers that be. Because they planted bombs, a lot of the bombs they planted were in restrooms. It was symbolic. It wasn't profoundly changing anything. And their program, was kind of a grab bag of, national liberation struggles are going to impact in the U.S. and we need to weaken the U.S. so that someday, somehow, there's going to be a whole, different world we can conceive of. So you have that, and it just gets, Google it, and you can spend a lifetime getting into this group, which I would argue is not that significant. I mean, it's significant in terms of it's become the prototype of what happens if you go down a certain road of radicalism. But then you have this RURCP experience, which, and also even progressive labor in its early days was seen as a much bigger problem for the powers that be. Actual coherent organization with a line and program, discipline, being mindful of laws and attempting to connect with a wide population. I mean, that's like major stuff. And that's with all the caveats that, they didn't have everything figured out. They did a lot of stuff that was really bad. If I had it to do over again, I would have left the group probably in 1980 and reflected on the experience. But there's some rich topography that these folks walked on, and they were seriously dedicated. I make a point in the book that these are more, some of the most dedicated people I've ever met in my life. And they weren't wrong for wanting a qualitatively different world. And dedicating their lives to it. But the matter of how one goes about it, it's the big question. I suspect I'll be gone before that all gets sorted out. But I think what Connor and I have left is a very rich document on, the aspirations of those people, how they cohered it in, went from being the Bay Area Revolutionary Union to being in 40 cities around the country very rapidly, spread like wildfire. And then, it's a rise and decline story. And then within that, you've got this Javert of J. Edgar Hoover, who's just up there in their business at every turn. And it's astonishing. It is probably one of the biggest investigations, if not, I can't say it is the biggest investigation, but as far as of its type, if you read the Bureau's reports, it is given pride of place over everyone else. The Weathermen get a lot of attention, but that's a criminal investigation. It's a qualitatively different thing. And it makes them more vulnerable to be kind of rounded up. You don't have to deal with these constitutional niceties of freedom of speech and such in the U.S. But I just think there's a lot in this book that it's a missing section that we've been fighting like mad to get put in there. And then the other point is, Maoism was a thing in the U.S. It wasn't just this third world Marxism, this term that's kind of entered the lexicon. There was a thing called Mao Zedong, Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And I think historians, if you want to get it right, you got to dignify that and kind of go. And, Josh, I think your work is, there's still a currency out there. There's still a goodly number of people who are still cohering to it. It's a little too soon to stop talking about it. Where it all ends is beyond me, but it needs to be put there and looked at critically and understood well. So I see, Kenny, we're going toward an hour, and I wanted to shut up and give Connor some air.
We still got time. We still got a good maybe 20 minutes. I
was just going to highlight some of the points that Aaron was making in the sense of when we were writing the book, we were trying to figure out when does it end, since the group still exists. And we sort of came to the end point. We didn't know this when we started, but it turned out to work out quite nicely in the sense that the FBI stopped monitoring the RCP in the way it had done throughout its whole history, like around 79, 80, 81. So there was that ending, but then there was also ending, there was sort of the last split that really kind of broke the group, which is sort of the split over, is China still a socialist country after Mao died, or was it now on the capitalist road? And that split cut the party in half. But there was also an aspect of what was also different about the RU, as opposed, because there's sort of this idea, well, the FBI was just keeping tabs on everyone. To a degree, yes, but that sort of misses the importance that they placed on certain things. The thing that's unique about the RU versus the other 60s groups is, as Aaron was just mentioning in relation to the Weathermen was mostly a criminal investigation, is there was no criminal investigation for the RU. It was all based on politics. They didn't, even if you're looking at certain aspects of Panthers or BLA, even if you were going to say that's politically motivated, which it largely is, there's elements of which they're able to rope in a criminal investigation around certain things like illegal firearms and things like that. They had nothing like that on the RU. So it's completely political. And by the late 70s, early 80s, and what's interesting also is we think about the church committee hearings in the late 70s that began to put a squash on this. They didn't close any of this FBI investigation after Quenzo Bro happened on the RU. They didn't close it during the church committee hearings. They really only closed it when they thought the RU wasn't that much of a threat anymore. And to the degree that we find files that pop up later in the 80s, it's really a question of someone getting arrested, or famously Gregory Johnson of the RCP being arrested for flag burning that was technically a violation of state law, right? So, but it also works out well ending the book that time because, as Aaron was saying, with Mao dead, with remained of the party thinking that China was no longer on the socialist road, there was this idea of what was going to hold the party together. And so they had done various campaigns like we're going to increase the weekly distribution of the newspaper to 100,000, which was not a success. We're going to bring 1 million people out for May Day in 1980. That was not a success. And there essentially becomes this turn of, as Aaron was saying, of essentially trying to copy the Free Huey campaign and this idea of just making an immense cult around this one leader and that this person's a savior. I mean, if we think about some of the worst aspects of the Free Huey campaign, the stuff of supreme servant of the people and all these sort of things, right? And this essentially became the adherent. Now, that's not to say if you were in 1981, it looks the same. The cult around Avakian looks the same as it does in modern times. But felt comfortable ending the book because when you then look back, all the pieces for what would become later were all there in terms of his prominence. There's this whole thing of Avakian playing part of the RU. But if you actually look at the RU stuff, even before he officially becomes like the leader in like 74-ish, but they don't even publicly announce it. It's not this idea of everything revolves around this person. And one of the real strengths of the party initially was the fact that like this professor, Franklin was sitting on the Central Committee, and then you also have Bob Avakian, and then you also have old C peers and people who've been in the PL. It was this whole diversity of people. And we highlighted 4 people in the beginning of the book, and at each major split, one of them falls away. And by the end, the only thing you have left is Avakian. So the party that was a party initially of different people, different leaders, became the party of one leader. And then this idea of, well, what was going to cohere them? I mean, you have Ronald Reagan's 80s, you have no more socialist China. And the thing that, whether consciously or unconsciously, the thing that they decided was going to adhere that party was the specialness of this leader. And there are different points at which that just goes gradually, and then other times where it becomes much more extreme. But the seeds for all that, I think, really are in like the late 70s, early 80s, when there's nothing to point towards as what's going to take us to another world. And if you think about it, the way they're actually phrasing their perceived importance of Avakian now is really how they used to talk about countries. This is the thing that's going to take us to a new world. Here's the thing that's showing us the future. And it's really sort of borrowing from the same playbook. It just seems absurd to people because a country that is actually a force in the world that can actually like influence things makes sense to people, even if you disagree with it. The idea of a person that most people are unfamiliar with is a much bigger leap in logic.
Yeah, I want to just maybe throw in at the end so I like another question that we won't get to. So I just want to indicate it here because you already kind of answered this question in your answer to my previous question. That's just the point that you talk about this book putting forward this stuff about the new communist movement, specifically the RU, RCP, USA, and how valuable that is, because most people do get hung up on this kind of the new left and the Weathermen and all this stuff like that. And then they just gloss over that period of the new communist movement, which as you point out, there's this whole history there, not just with the RU, RCP, USA, but also around the world. There's this whole history of the new communist movement that I think a lot of people are recovering and trying to, because we can learn a lot through the different struggles, rightly and wrongly, from that period, because there was so much. But it is this period that is like a kind of, people don't see it as exciting as the Weathermen or something like that. But I do think it's, in my opinion, at least, it's much more important to learn from. And so I think your book was a great contribution to that.
It seemed like being a weatherman in circa 73, 74 was probably really boring and very detailed oriented, just trying to, falsify ID, bullshit some landlord into renting you an apartment. And not, well, actually.
You have to look like you're not a revolutionary all the time, basically. Which is the exact opposite of what the sort of cultural revolution movement was about, which is about spreading this idea of revolution everywhere and overturning everything. You have these people, because the FBI and police were looking for them, that basically, and you get this from reading all their memoirs, that they basically had to look like and act like average everyday Americans all the time.
I think the RU, when I was coming around, they had, everybody's sectarian and everybody's sniping at each other. I don't know what it is about that leads to that, but they said, well, the Weathermen are underground. Gophers are going to make the revolution. That was the little snark at them. But actually, I was researching something for something I'm working on now. Breaking Joanne Chesimard, Assata Shakur, out of prison. I don't know if you can believe this or not, but Tyrone Risson was an informant. Well, he flipped. He was kind of working with the Black Liberation Army at the end of the 70s, but he made a statement like, we were doing all these bank robberies to survive. we did the Chesimard thing to try to get some kind of politics associated. But I think the world had changed. I made this point earlier. 1979 is not 1969. The U.S. is no longer confronting Chinese socialism and Russian communism. They don't have to worry about China in the same way. China actually invades North Vietnam in 1979. North Vietnam actually invades, Kampuchea, which is a boon for the Soviets and bad for the U.S. It's not the same contradictions. The U.S. can now focus on, Ronald Reagan and bringing down the evil empire. There's a redoubling. Détente disappears. The dissension, Nixon knocked the wind out of the anti-war movement by beginning to bring troops home and, doing an increased air war. Again, these are material factors that impel you to activism, which is why, I think Zizek made this point and Babavakian made this point. Well, never underestimate the power of ideology. Well, I'm not a Philistine and I'm not an anti-intellectual, but you can't talk your way into, huge cataclysmic social change. It takes profound, actual motion, undergirding this. And yeah, a lot of times it comes seemingly out of nowhere, but as a historian, you can look back and see what existed in 76, 79 compared to 66 and 69. There was a reason this group came into being, and then there was a reason this group waned. Just another point too, which is the new communist movement in the Chinese. I kind of discovered this working on the intro. The Chinese never really gave the RU its full endorsement, its franchise. They didn't give it to anybody. And I came to realize, off of talking to some folks who were around at the time, the Chinese were conflicted themselves. Mao was still a pretty radical guy, and he's dying. But he's surrounded by people like Deng Xiaoping and a lot of people in the Politburo who are very conservative. They've led long lives. They've gone through the long march. They've got a little bit of power, and they kind of want to maintain it. So, Mao endorsing the RU or the RCP in 71 is not something that's going to happen. It's kind of like he gives support by inviting the RU delegation, but then he withholds any kind of official, blessing. It's only in, I believe, 77 that this smaller organization that had been the October League, they had named themselves the Communist Party Marxist-Lenin. It's only when Mao dies that the leader of the CPML meets with Hua Guofeng and kind of gets his official endorsement. 2 years later, they're both gone. That group is gone and Hua Guofeng is gone. So the Chinese are not just openly embracing things because they're fraught. They're about to go through a pretty convulsive change. So that's actually something new in the book. In the spirit of bigger global transformations are going on than just the subjective will or the individual cleverness. And I don't say that in a disparaging way necessarily of any particular leader. So, I guess that goes back to your cult point too. It's this cult of personalities never really worked out very well, by the way. People, somebody ought to write a book, the failed project of the cult of personality. It's not too good to put all your eggs in that.
I think we're just slowly running out of time. I think I have about 5 minutes left. So I just wanted to jump in and ask what kinds of projects you two have going on at the moment. I was looking at your website, Aaron. It looks like you have about 4 books coming out in the next year or so. But I'm curious to hear about yourself, Connor, as well. What are you both working on these days?
I'll let Aaron go first, since it's coming out sooner.
So we did the revised Heavy Radicals. That's out October 28th. So look, a lot of people watching this will have already bought the book, and that's great. And it's expensive. it's going to be like $29.95. I talked to the publisher and they're like, we can't bend on this. They got to make money. Is it right? I don't know. We can argue that. So if you already bought the book and you're hesitant and you just want to see the new material, two things. You can buy the ebook, which is less expensive, or if you want to support our research, buy the book. A lot of effort went into this, and we have not recouped what we put into it. Okay, so that's happening October 28th. On Valentine's Day, I'm publishing also with Repeater Books, who's now brother or sister of Zer0 Books, a book called Whole World in an Uproar, Music, Rebellion, and Repression from 1955 to 1972. And it's the story of the way the status quo and the FBI, to a degree, went after people like Miriam Makeba, Dave Van Ronk. I've even got some FBI files that reference Bob Dylan and the ways they were going after him. But then also the kind of larger governmental and social repressive forces, like the war on drugs. You've got this phenomenon in 66 to 69 where the band, like the Grateful Dead or Jefferson Airplane, they go back to their hotel and the police are there to arrest them, for drugs. And it's all part of a social repression, reacting to forces that are seriously challenging the status quo, either the Black Freedom Movement, the anti-war movement, or the counterculture. So, I've got a good number of FBI files and quite a bit else. So that book is out February 14th. And then I've got a contract for another book, but I'm not going to talk about that now because that's in the too much. But Connor's got a project he's working on that's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Well, my project, fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it, keeps getting bigger. But essentially, at this point, it's now, I guess, essentially trying to do a history of the 20th century and about the interaction between the FBI and communism, full stop. So essentially, from the origins of the FBI, which is roughly the time of the origin of the communist movement in the U.S., through, I guess, roughly probably about the church committee hearings. So essentially try to put the whole context of FBI intelligence and counterintelligence in a bigger framework within sort of the whole U.S. Soviet century.
Well, it sounds like you both are working on some fantastic things. Maybe once your book with Repeater is out, Aaron, we'll have to have you back on. And likewise, Connor, for your work on at the FBI and communism. That sounds like an immense undertaking. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Connor, for joining us. And thank you so much, Josh, as well, for helping me out with this.
It was a pleasure.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.